Without that ethical code, science would collapse. Recently, in the United States, for example, there have been a rash of incidents which have called into question this ethical code. Graduate students have been discovered to have plagiarized portions of their doctoral dissertation in order to get their degree. And certain scientists have even fudged their data in order to get government grants for their research. Once this ethical code is compromised, the whole scientific enterprise collapses because nobody is in a position to check out personally the results of everybody else's research. Or consider again the question of what is permissible to do with animals in scientific research. This is not a scientific question. This is an ethical question about what one is allowed to do to animals in one's research. If you deny that there are any ethical truths about these sorts of things, then there can be no objection to using human beings as guinea pigs in medical experiments. The world was horrified when it discovered that at camps like Auschwitz and Dachau, Nazi scientists had used prisoners for medical experimentation on living human beings. For example, I remember seeing a BBC television program a few years back in which a woman was interviewed who was forced to become the gynecologist in Auschwitz. And she noticed that Dr. Mengele had all of the women who were pregnant housed together in one barracks. And after some time, she noticed that she no longer saw any of these women. She made inquiries. What happened to those women who were housed in that barracks? Oh, haven't you heard? Came the reply. Dr. Mengele used them for vivisection. From a scientific point of view, there is no moral objection to this. How can you show the Nazi scientists scientifically that what they were doing was wrong? What experiments could you perform? What data could you gather to show that this is immoral? Moral values cannot be found in a test tube. And thus, the point is that ethical truths do exist. I think we all recognize this. And yet, ethical truths cannot be proven scientifically. Secondly, aesthetics. Like the good, the beautiful also cannot be determined by the scientific method. Imagine, for example, viewing a beautiful sunset from a mountaintop vista. Scientifically, you could give a description of that scene in terms of the refraction of the sun's rays through the dust and the atmosphere. You could give a description of the plate tectonics which resulted in the mountain building geological processes causing the upheaval of the hills on which you sit. You could give a scientific classification of the flora and the fauna that inhabit the mountainside. And yet this scientific description would completely leave out of account any notion of the aesthetic qualities of that scene, of the beauty of that sunset that is before you. And yet, think of how important this aesthetic intuition is in the life of mankind. The whole artistic impulse of man depends upon this aesthetic impulse. Music, painting, sculpture, film, poetry, literature, and so on and so forth. Try to imagine, if you can, a world devoid of aesthetic intuitions. That would be the scientific world. And yet, even scientists themselves cannot avoid making aesthetic judgments in their work. Very often, you will hear the mathematical equations of a theory described as elegant or beautiful. Indeed, some scientific theorists actually propose beauty as one of the major tests for the truth of a scientific theory. There are aesthetic truths, and we all know it. There is a difference between the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel and the ceiling in my house. And yet this whole realm of the aesthetic is closed to the scientific method and to scientific proof. Number 3, metaphysics. There are truths about the nature of reality which we all accept and are rational in doing so, and yet which cannot be proven scientifically. For example, how do you know that you are not a brain in a vat? How do you know you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals being stimulated by some mad scientist with electrodes to believe that you're here in this room hearing this lecture? He might even be stimulating your brain to believe that it's impossible that you're a brain in a vat. How could you disprove such a thing? There is no way to prove scientifically that you are not a brain in a vat. Or take the hypothesis that the world was created 5 minutes ago. How could you disprove that the world was created 5 minutes ago with built-in traces of age, food in our stomachs from the breakfasts we never really ate, memory traces in our brains of events that we never really experienced? There's no way scientifically to prove that the world was not created 5 minutes ago. Or take the hypothesis that the external world exists. How could you prove that the external world exists scientifically? How could you disprove that this is not all a dream or a hallucination of your mind? Or what about the statement that other minds exist? How do you know that these other people sitting around you really have minds? Maybe they're just all automata who exhibit external behavior that looks like they have minds, but they really don't. You're really the only genuine person in this room, you know. There's no way to prove scientifically that other minds exist. Now, you might say at this point, well, these are only ideas that some crack-brained philosopher would entertain. But then you'd be missing the point. I'm not suggesting that these hypotheses are really true or that you should be doubtful about these things. Of course the external world exists. Of course you're not a brain in a vat. You'd have to be crazy to think that the world was created 5 minutes ago. But what this illustrates is that this criterion of rationality is far too restrictive to be plausible. These are beliefs which are what epistemologists or theorists of knowledge call properly basic beliefs. That is to say, they are beliefs which are part of the foundation of your cognitive structure. They cannot be scientifically proved, but nevertheless we are rational to believe in such propositions. Finally, number 4, science itself. This is the most amazing and paradoxical of all. If you only believe what can be scientifically proved, you would not believe in science itself. This can be shown in 2 ways. First of all, science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. Let me give some examples. First of all, the Copernican Principle. The Copernican Principle states that we occupy no special place in the cosmos, that our vantage point in the cosmos is typical of what you would see from any other position in the universe. The Copernican Principle underlies all of modern astronomy and astrophysics. Otherwise, you would never know that the distant galaxies, for example, might not operate under totally different laws of nature than the laws that we perceive here. And thus we must assume the Copernican Principle. And yet this principle is strictly unprovable scientifically. We just have to make this assumption. Second example, the Continuum hypothesis. According to the Continuum hypothesis, between any 2 points, there is always another point. Between any 2 points, there is always another point.